driest state in the country. Utah is the second driest state in the country, and our rivers are life support systems for fish and wildlife species. Our rivers have no legal right to exist. They can dry up and disappear because the system of water governance that our Utah legislature has created encourages water diversions for the purposes, honestly, of money making. And so we have this idea that we're in a crisis, but we're not all on the same page about where the crisis comes from. Somewhere between 80 and 85% of all the water we use in Utah is for agriculture, mostly low value agriculture. So the crisis to me is that our fish and wildlife vesicles, our rivers and streams and lakes, are disappearing and drying up. And we're getting lip service from politicians that they're really working to protect it while they're not. We're in a little bit of a dysfunctional space about climate change. There are a lot of people now that understand that climate change is increasing our air temperatures in our winter and therefore shrinking our snowpacks, which provide 85 to 90% of the water we drink and use on our farms and in our cities, outside our homes and businesses. So we're shrinking our reservoirs up in the mountains, our snowpack reservoirs, where all of the water that fills these reservoirs comes from because of increased carbon emissions. And yet the state of Utah has virtually no climate adaptation policies to speak of. Again, we have the least expensive water rates in the country, and our water conservancy districts, the wholesale water suppliers that are delivering our water, are given almost godlike power to dictate policy to state legislators. And for that reason, we're in a pickle. We are literally decades behind many other Western states in adopting good policies to protect these free-flowing rivers and streams that feed the Great Salt Lake and the Utah Lake. And we're wondering what to do about it. It seems like we refuse to learn from other states surrounding us about what good river management and lake management and water management and conservation policy looks like. So that's gonna start for me what the problem is. I'll come back in subsequent comments, talk about solutions. I appreciate the chance to speak. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Frankel. Next, Dr. Lozada.
Thank you very much for inviting me. My comments are going to stress the contribution that agriculture makes to Utah's water problems. So it's a nice compliment to Zach Frankel, who was talking a little bit about agriculture, but mostly about the problems in urban areas. So to give you an overview, and some of these statistics you already heard from Zach, about 4% of Utah's total water use is indoor residential. About 8% is outdoor residential. About 2% is commercial, 2% is industrial, less than 1% is 2% is institutional, and less than 1% is industrial. So what's the rest? The rest is 82%, and it's agriculture. So for large water savings, we're going to have to look at the agricultural sector. The residential sector, the urban sector, that's not going to be enough. I wrote a report that has gotten lots of public interest these days, and it's about in particular the role of agriculture in general and alfalfa in particular in Utah's water picture. So I calculated that the percentage of Utah's water that's used for growing hay, now hay includes alfalfa and also grass hay, but it's mostly alfalfa. The percentage of Utah's water that's used for growing hay was about 68%. So roughly 2/3 of the water that Utah uses goes to just one crop. Well, two crops, alfalfa hay and grass hay. The value in 2020 of Utah's hay production was $440 million. That's about 0.2% of Utah's GDP. In other words, 1/5 of 1% of Utah's GDP is used to is generated by 2/3 of Utah's water. So we're using a huge amount of water to generate a crop that, in the grand scheme of things, is a very tiny part of Utah's economy. The profit, by the way, earned by Utah farmers from growing that hay was about $242 million. So this immediately suggests, I'm an economist, this immediately suggests to an economist the so-called buy and dry approach, where if we need water in urban areas or we need water for nature, what we would do is to buy the water from farmers and for a fairly inexpensive amount, fully compensating farmers for their losses, and then use it for other things. So just to give you some examples, by the way, as a footnote, about 29% of Utah's hay is exported to foreign countries. About 2/3 of that goes to China. So here's one policy scenario. Stop growing hay. Don't change Utah's population size. Divert all the water that's saved back to nature. That would cost about $80 per person per year to reimburse the farmers for their losses for not growing hay. How about if instead you want to use the water not for nature, but for increasing the population size? The experience of Arizona is quite remarkable. It uses less water now than it did in 1957, despite its population growing by a factor of 7. So one idea is divert water to urban areas, not to nature, stop growing hay, stop urban outdoor watering. If you did that, then indoor residential water use could increase 18-fold. And the population similarly could increase 18-fold if industrial, commercial, and institutional use was unchanged. Now, what would the cost be? Well, if you have 18 times more people, it wouldn't be very expensive. $4.10 per capita per year to reimburse the farmers for that. I'll just talk about one other scenario. What happens if we continued urban outdoor watering? Then the population could increase 6-fold, and it would cost about $12 per capita to reimburse the farmers. One final point, well, if we stop growing hay, what effect is that going to have on food prices? Utah's hay growing acreage represents 1.4% of the total number of acres devoted to growing hay in the United States. I don't think that the price of food is going to change very much if Utah stops growing hay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lozada. And now, Dr. Yost, please.
Yes, can you hear me okay? Very good. Pleasure to be here tonight. Oh, I thought you were trying to tell me to speak up. Sorry, saw some fingers raised. I'll try to speak up. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Two former speakers have done a good job, and Jim at talking about the issues. Our task tonight is to talk about some potential solutions. It's impossible to cover solutions to all of these challenges because it will require a lot. So I'll speak tonight just briefly about those that I'm most familiar with, and that's water use for agriculture in Utah. So it's already been mentioned that agriculture uses the majority of the diverted water, so water that we divert and use. If you look at total water use in Utah, it's a very, very small portion. The vast majority of the water consumed in the state of Utah is consumed by our environment. Agriculture takes a lot of heat for the large amount of water that they use. They can improve in large ways, or they can, and in large ways they are. But it requires, in many cases, lots of investment. This is investment on the farm to improve irrigation systems and management on the farm. Also requires massive investments in conveyance systems, the pipes, the canals that deliver water to farms. These investments, in most cases, are larger than most farmers can make on their own, and still have a profitable operation, profitable farm. So solutions will require helping to make these investments in improving agriculture's water use. Mm-hmm. I would also mention that this industry is well worth preserving in the state of Utah. The majority of citizens state that they want agriculture here and they want it to stay, and they're willing to do something about it. This industry is the lifeblood of rural Utah. I would suggest that rural Utah would not exist without agriculture. It is the lifeblood of their economies, and has been for a long time. And so it will require investments, large investments in improving agricultural water use, developing water markets so that water can be leased and transferred between farms and cities. Fortunately, new legislation is making that more feasible, more possible. Yet there's still many hurdles to overcome, solutions to find to make these markets a reality. And in my view, they're critical. They're critical to the water security of our state, is learning how to market and transfer water between different uses. Ultimately, the solution to many of those issues that were stated is going to require all sectors, not just agriculture. That means that all of us will need to use less water. And it will require a lot of change, innovations, and some major investments in order to secure our water future. Thanks. I look forward to discussing this more.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, Dr. Yost. And now Dr. Mensch.
Hi, Jim, and fellow panel members and members of the public. I'm Dr. Brian Mensch, president of Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment, one of the largest civic organizations of healthcare professionals in the Western United States, with about 450 physician members and about 3,000 members of the lay public. Our banner issue is not water issue, but air pollution and the climate crisis. But I do want to talk about the connection between the two. But before I do that, let me give you a little bit of history and background to our air pollution problem. When we organized our group in 2007, the signature air pollution problem along the Wasatch Front was one of our winter inversions, and we're all familiar with it. And we formed our group after about a 30 straight day episode of one of these inversions when we didn't see the sun. We could hardly see across the street in our own neighborhoods. And we realized that as physicians, we really didn't know that much about the issue and how much of a public health hazard. So we had to first educate ourselves. But at that time, winter inversions really were about the only thing that people thought of in terms of our air pollution problem. But things have changed quite a bit over the last 15 years, much of which is due to the change in the climate crisis. We now have less winter inversion pollution because our winters are less severe. We have less snowfall on the ground, and snowfall on the ground and the cool temperature that creates near the ground surface is one of the contributors to our inversion setup. But in contrast, as we're enjoying less winter inversion pollution, we're also at the same time experiencing more and more exposure to the consequences of the climate crisis in terms of more wildfire smoke. We had a fairly decent summer this year, but for the 3 previous years, we had persistent wildfire smoke throughout much of Utah for almost 4 straight months each of the last 3 years. And wildfire pollution is actually biologically a little more toxic. In fact, in some ways, a lot more toxic than just general winter pollution, inversion pollution generated by smokestacks and tailpipes. We are now also seeing significant episodes of dust pollution. 90% of the dust that is generated in the Great Basin now comes from drying lake beds. And we're seeing, or we've gone from what used to be almost 0 episodes of dust events when we started our group in 2007 to about 15 to 16 of these major dust events every year. And in case anyone is tempted to think that, well, these dust events are short-lived and therefore that not that much of a problem, We also know that the kind of tiny nanoparticles that you inhale, whether it be from dust or from tailpipes or smokestacks, that may still reside deeply within your lungs and your bloodstream and your kidneys and your liver and all your critical organs for months afterwards. And the biological damage that is done by those tiny particles persists. In fact, that's reflected in the fact that community mortality rates don't go back to normal for sometimes months after an air pollution event is over with. So the dust pollution events that we are now unfortunately very familiar with are not short-lived public health hazards, they're long-lived public health hazards. And with the climate crisis, we are now also seeing higher levels of ozone, because ozone is the result of chemical reactions in the atmosphere catalyzed by heat. So on the one hand, we're having less winter inversion pollution, but on the other hand, we're having an increase in other significant sources of pollution. And one of the most important of which is the fact that our lakes are disappearing, especially the Great Salt Lake. And that is leaving a dry lake bed now that is much more exposed, and the source not only of dust pollution, but because that dust is contaminated with heavy metals. And you've heard a lot about arsenic from multiple articles written about it, but you haven't heard as much about mercury, because it's also heavily contaminated with mercury. And mercury is probably the most neurotoxic substance that we know of, probably orders of magnitude on a per weight basis more toxic than lead is. So there is now a growing connection between our water usage and our poor public policy on how we manage water and the air pollution that we're all exposed to. And we need to think of them both as problems that are interrelated and deserve to be solved. And now I've run out of time to solve any of them.
Well, you have 1 minute left, Brian.
Okay, well, in 1 minute, then I'm going to solve all these problems.
Solve it. Do
Okay,
it.
done. Actually, I don't have, I was depending on people like Zach to solve the problem. But I do think that we need to understand that our environmental problems are all interrelated. When we look at the consequences of the climate, my timer says I'm done. But anyway, when we look at things like the effect of the climate crisis on our forest viability, we know that hotter temperatures not only accelerate the melt of snowpack, but they create increased stress on all of our forests, and those trees are absorbing water sooner and more water than they would have without the climate crisis. So that accelerates the demand on our water supplies. So it's all interrelated.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mensch. And now, Dr. McCool, please.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for having me. Let's start with this thought. We don't have a water crisis. We have a water management crisis. We have been managing water for the last 100 years as though it was infinite, as though it was low value. And when we abused it or misused it or wasted it, we could always get our hands on more. And that's part of what I call the Western water mindset, was that we'll just solve all of our problems through structural solutions. We'll just build dams and pipelines and diversions, and we'll take water from someone else or someplace else, and we'll use that water, and we can continue wasting water and having Kentucky bluegrass lawns and paying very little for it. The Western water mindset was focused, and still is focused, on building things that don't create water, they don't make it rain, they don't increase our water supply, they simply move it around and change the timing. And the Western water mindset is also very dependent on federal funding. For decades, we depended on the federal government to build giant projects out west and really allow us to live way beyond any kind of reasonable water budget. But two things have happened. First of all, Now water's scarce. There is no other place to get water that isn't being used or will be used. So if you build a pipeline means that you're going to take water away from somebody and give it to somebody else. There was a time in the past when there were very few people or just Native Americans where you were taking it and we ignored them. Today, people don't like that. Today, everybody realizes that water is scarce and they don't want their water taken away. So there is no sort of freebie source of water that we can just tap into, build more dams and build more pipelines and solve our problems. That worked in an age of resource abundance. That approach does not work in an age of scarcity, and we're definitely in an age of scarcity. The other problem with this mindset, of course, is that it was dependent on federal funding. The federal government's hugely in debt. We can't just use the federal government as a sugar daddy to solve our problems when we should be solving them ourselves. That's how we got into this mess. And when I say mess, that worked well. We had plenty of water for the last 100 years. I've never run out of water. Well, that's not true. I live in Ogden and they've turned off my irrigation water a couple of times, but I can still turn on the tap. But it's not going to work for the future. It's not going to work in an age of scarcity. What we need now is a completely new approach to water. And it really gets down to a question of ethics. We need a new water ethic. And I know this sounds like pie in the sky. Nobody's going to do that. Actually, everybody's going to do it because no one is a protector of the status quo when they turn on the tap and the water comes out. When you run out of water, you realize we got to make some changes. And there are communities in Utah that have already reached that limit where they had to stop new construction because there was no more water for water connection. So we're seeing that happen. We're seeing it happening in a very big way in the Colorado River Basin with dramatic cuts in Arizona, Nevada, less so in California and the upper basin states, but they're coming. They will happen. So we have to adopt a new water ethic so that we can live within our water means. And a water ethic is focused on, first of all, sustainability over the long term. That we have to think about how our actions affect subsequent generations, not just the bottom line for this quarter. The new water ethic emphasizes inclusion. Today, water policy is a very exclusive, almost secretive procedure, and we need all the public involved. We need everybody involved. And a new water ethic has to focus on water justice. We can't just raise all the prices on everybody. We should raise the prices on a lot of people, but not the poorest of the poor. There needs to be a human right to the basic water needs of human beings, not lawns, not other activities, but just a basic human right. So if we start thinking in a different fashion about our relationship with water, then we'll start seeing different sets of solutions. And there are solutions. There are lots of ideas that have been espoused by the other people on the panel here. So we have lots of solutions. We just need to change our water mindset. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCool. Now, let's see here. Let me flip back to gallery view. Now, each panelist will have the opportunity to ask one other panelist one question. Please keep your questions and answers brief and to the point. So any panelist can ask one question of any other panelist. Who would like to go first? Go ahead, Dan. You're muted.
I want to ask Zach Frankel a question. Zach, we keep hearing from our local water conservancy districts that they simply cannot survive unless they're heavily subsidized through property taxes. Are there water districts and conservancy districts in the West that actually get along just fine without property taxes?
Oh, thank you so much for asking that question. And it's a good one. And we're lucky to have Professor Gabriel Lozada on this economics department of the University of Utah on this panel, the wizard of economics regarding the property tax issue in Utah. So our organization just completed a survey of 342 water suppliers across 10 Western states. And we went carefully through their audited financial statements and found that the vast majority of water suppliers in the American West do not collect near the proportion of property taxes that Utah water districts do. So the average of the 342 water suppliers, if you take, it's actually the ones once you take the Utah water districts out of that, it's about 337 water suppliers that we studied, only in the urban markets. Outside of Utah, those water suppliers collect just 9% of their revenues from property taxes. And they typically collect them to pay bonds. And when the bonds are paid off, the property tax goes away.
Zach,
We found,
Zach, what is your solution? What is your solution?
hold on. Just a moment, Jim. So we found that Utah water districts are collecting 3 times the proportion of property taxes. They're getting 1/4 of their revenues from property taxes. So here in conservative Utah, we are over collecting property taxes to lower the price of water. If we phase out those property taxes, we would be able to let the high volume water users pay for their water use. Schools, government owned institutions, universities, golf courses, things like that, that have some of the cheapest water rates in the United States, subsidized by low income populations that are paying property taxes on their homes, businesses, if they're involved in any businesses, and even on their automobiles. So we have got to get rid of these property taxes, as Professor McCool said, and incentivize people and institutions to use water appropriately, because everybody sees people and businesses and institutions watering sidewalks, streets, and gutters all the time, watering while it's raining, watering in November. We've got to stop doing that because it's just wasteful.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Zach.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Thank you.
Thank you. Does any of the other panelists have a question for one of the other panelists? Go ahead. Gabrielle, go ahead, and then Brian after you.
All right. I agree with Professor Yost when he said that agriculture is the lifeblood of rural Utah and that citizens want it to stay. However, unlike Professor Yost, I don't think that agriculture in Utah is sustainable at its current level. Professor McCool said that the new water ethic emphasizes inclusion and water justice. So this question is to Dan McCool, and I wanted to ask him if putting water use in Utah on a sustainable basis means shrinking Utah's agricultural sector and the rural communities that depend on it, how can we do that in a way that emphasizes the inclusion of people who are farmers or who live in rural areas? And how can we do that with a commitment to justice to them while still shrinking the agricultural sector to a sustainable level?
Sure. First of all, I would much rather live next to a bunch of hay farms than to see the population grow by a factor of 18 times. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people in this state that actually believe that infinite growth is a good thing and is feasible. It's not. It's a recipe for eco-suicide, but a lot of people would like to see a doubling, tripling, just pick your number, 40 times, 80 times. Who knows where the limit is? And that water is going to come from farms. And I think the best strategy is to create a voluntary marketing situation where farmers, when they choose, if they choose, they can market their water, either sell or lease at their choice in an open market and receive fair market value for it. It'd make a lot of farmers rich. I'm totally good with that. And it's a higher economic value, if you will, for the water than growing hay. It just makes more sense. And it makes a whole lot more sense to solve our water problems through working with farmers and to solve our environmental problems than to build more crazy projects like the Bear River Project or the Lake Powell Pipeline, or these absolutely absurd ideas about building some kind of pipeline from the Pacific Ocean to the Great Salt Lake. We got to get away from thinking about that and thinking about how we use water wisely. That's the solution. We have the solution here, and it needs to be an inclusive, collaborative process.
Thank you, Dr. McCool. Brian, I think you were next. You waved your hand. Go ahead. Yes.
In 2009, one of the best things our physicians group did was we made a formal presentation to the leaders of the LDS Church on the public health hazards of air pollution. And I would like to say that the LDS Church changed their policies as a result of our presentation, but they did change some. And to a person that listened to our presentation, they did seem to be appreciative of a great deal of the educational value of our presentation to them. My question is, and this is to all the panelists, have any of you had the opportunity or even made the effort to talk to LDS Church leaders about this problem? Because we obviously have a lot of centers of power in this state, and one of them are religious centers of power, and we should be getting their buy-in on whatever solutions we decide are the most important. So I'm just wondering if anybody's had any opportunity like that or pursued any.
Looks like no one is answering your. Oh, go ahead, Dan.
I'll just mention.
Like Gabe, we publish a lot, and everyone's free to read what we're publishing. And we have lots of ideas in our publications. Zach's organization publishes a lot of incredible information. Everybody can read it. It's all out there, whether you're a religious leader or a political leader or a community leader. The educational material is available out there. We would only hope that people would be reading it and becoming informed about the reality of water in Utah.
Thank you, Dan. Zach, your hand is up. You have one question for one panelist.
Yeah, I have a question for Dr. Lozada. Maybe you could give us a little economics lesson. If we were, the price of water in Utah municipal markets for 50,000 gallons of water, which is a lot of water, 50,000 gallons in a month, more than 1,000 gallons a day. If the price of that water is $2 to $3 per 1,000 gallons, and the price of water in Los Angeles is like $15 per 1,000, could you tell us a little bit, Dr. Lozada, what would be the ancillary benefits if we raised the water price in municipal markets? We raise prices at that high volume. What would happen in terms of some of the water markets that Dr. McCool has mentioned, what would be the ancillary benefits? Obviously, we raise the price of water, we're going to reduce demand, and that's going to extend water supplies and provide more water available for the environment. But generally, what are the ancillary economic benefits for raising the price in terms of creating opportunity for buying or providing water for rivers and lakes?
Well, Zach, you put your finger on the fundamental problem, which is that, and I apologize, my dog is barking, which is that it's been government policy ever since the 19th century not to charge a market clearing price for water, to charge in urban areas a very low price. And farmers don't pay anything. They pay for the water, right, but they don't pay per gallon of water. There are no water meters on farms. So what you have is a resource that is either used at a zero price or a very low price. This distortion of the free market system is fundamentally what causes the problem. I mean, if you take any valuable resource and charge nothing for it, you're going to have a shortage and people are going to overuse it. Furthermore, it messes up the price signals downstream. Crops, for example, that use less water crops that use more water would get penalized if farmers had to pay for water. But right now they're not. And so people purchasing crops don't get those signals about what crops use more water than others. It messes up the entire working of the free market price system. So putting rational prices on water, both in agricultural use and in urban areas, would basically rationalize the entire system. Now, one doesn't have to make farmers pay. Another way to do it is to offer to pay farmers. That makes the money flow in the other direction, let's say from urban areas or from the state to protect nature to farmers, but it still makes farmers think about the cost of water and serves a similar function.
Hey, that's very, very good. So does any of the other panelists have one more question for one of the panelists, or are we about ready to look over some issues we may have missed? Go ahead, Brian. You have a question for one of the panelists?
Well, it was mentioned that I think 30% of the alfalfa grown in the state of Utah gets exported to China. I have seen news articles dating back about 6 years ago at least that Chinese businessmen have bought Utah alfalfa farms. So that not only are we exporting our water in the form of boxed up alfalfa to China and Saudi Arabia, but we're also allowing Chinese businessmen to profit off of this, which magnifies the absurdity, obviously. Does anybody know how much of our alfalfa is grown by foreign businesses so that the revenue or profitability doesn't even stay in the state, or doesn't even stay in the country, let alone the state? And that's a question to all of the panelists. I don't.
That's a good question, Brian. I don't know, and I don't know that we have numbers on that, but it is a very, very small percentage of the land in Utah that's irrigated. I work with hundreds of farmers, and I can't think of one that's owned by a foreign company. So it's very, very small. I don't know what it is. Utah's not unique. There's foreign-owned land in every state. In some state, I would say most states in the Midwest have a higher percentage of foreign ownership than we do in Utah or the West. So it's there, but it's very, very minor.
Okay.
I'd just like to correct one thing. So 30% of Utah's hay is exported. 20% of Utah's hay, that's 2/3 of the exports, go to China. So about 20% of Utah's hay goes to China.
Okay. Well, I think we may have finished with our panelists asking other panelists questions. So I'm going to look at, and by the way, thank you panelists very much for your participation and your frank and open answers to these questions. I have two other questions I would like to ask of the panelists because I think they may not have been covered enough in our discussion so far. One has to do with a tricky issue. It's predicted, I think, that by 2050 we'll have 5.5 million people here now. We have about 3.5 million. What is that going to do? Is there anything that can be done about the very rapid population growth and the concomitant increasing demand for water? What can we do? What can be done? Panelists?
Well, maybe I'll start with that since I talked about population. Let me first say that although I did sketch these scenarios of Utah's population growing many multiple times bigger than it is right now, those weren't meant to be endorsements. I don't particularly endorse Utah's population growing. But the fact of the matter is, Utah's population could grow quite a bit if we raised less alfalfa. So there's no, as Dan McCool said, there's a water management problem. There's not a water problem. I mean, clearly there's going to be less water. I mean, climate change is doing that. So there is going to be pain, but water doesn't really, if the water system is managed in an economically rational way where water goes to the people who can pay for it, then water really doesn't form a constraint on Utah's population. I mean, I might wish that it did, but it actually doesn't.
Are you sort of saying that if we move water away from the agricultural section, then it can support a significantly larger population, keeping in mind that increasing population complicates and adds to virtually all environmental problems?
Well, that's why I said that I'm not endorsing increasing Utah's population. And the first scenario I sketched where we didn't change Utah's population at all, but we sent the water back to nature is the one that I would endorse. But if somebody else, not me, wanted to increase Utah's population, that's certainly a feasible thing to do. And the cost isn't particularly great. It does mean diverting water from agricultural areas that contribute very small amounts to Utah's GDP.
From a water perspective, does it make sense to take steps to limit Utah's population growth?
So I don't, unless you put something in the water that's a birth control measure, that's not going to happen. But what we can do is stop subsidizing growth. We subsidize suburban sprawl. We subsidize development in so many different ways. And one of the ways is through water, but we subsidize the energy, we subsidize the transportation, the highways, we subsidize all these things. There's two ways to limit growth. One of them is through a planned process that recognizes limits, carrying capacities, and the fact that we live on a finite planet that cannot continually grow infinitely. The other way to limit growth is you grow to the point where the quality of life is so bad, nobody wants to live here. That's the direction we're going. And yes, there's a prediction that the population will double to 6 million people in 20 years. My question is, and what about the doubling after that? And the doubling after that? And the doubling after that? Where does sanity come into this? And the answer is, it should no longer be a social value. Growth in the last 100 years was an economic and social asset. Today, it is an economic and social liability. And we need to recognize that through our growth policies and stop subsidizing growth and development.
One other question that I don't think was dealt with very much is how we are polluting our water, how cities, industries, agriculture is polluting our water. And also there was this proposal to dredge Utah Lake, which many people are thinking would have a very serious problem with water quality in the lake. So what can be done to substantially reduce the way we are polluting our water? That's a question for any panelist. And that's maybe the last question before we go to the public.
Well, we could talk about water quality for hours. Water quality is a big problem. There's a number of contaminants. The municipal runoff is a major problem. So if we would try and design our cities to have less impervious surfaces, less concrete, and more recharge along the way, if we capture runoff and we try and collect stormwater and put it in the ground, then that is much better for our rivers and lakes and our water quality. The population increase is going to further exacerbate that problem because there's more people, more runoff, more urbanized hardscapes. So that's a quick nutshell answer.
Good. Well, Bryce, you've had your hand up for quite a while. And I think, first of all, I would like to thank all the panelists for your excellent job here of dealing with this very, very complicated issue. And obviously, in an hour plus time, we won't be able to solve the problem, but we can work toward it. Go ahead, Bryce, your hand up. It's time now for the public to and participants to raise your hand and be recognized. And please keep your comments, your questions very short and direct them to our panelists. Thank you.
Excellent. My name is Bryce Christensen. I study permaculture, and we've got many examples on different continents of permaculture and putting native shrubs and trees into the mountains, which help to charge the aquifers, putting the water back into the ground. I mean, there's literally thousands. We've got schools of thought that do that here in Utah. We just need to educate and get that knowledge into people. Have you guys?
Your question, please.
Have you studied permaculture and seen the effect of it on other continents?
All right. Well, any of the panelists want to answer that question, please? Okay.
Bryce, not personally. USU does have several faculty working on permaculture. So I'd be happy to point you to some resources there if you're interested.
Have you seen how China is changing the Gobi Desert with permaculture?
That's another question, and I think you've had your turn. Let's turn. Ernie, your hand is up. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Yes. Dr. Mensch has an interesting topic for us. He almost gave us the solution, but not quite. He's worried about pollution coming from exposed lake bed. How can we cover up those lake beds?
Well, there are people on this panel who have, I think, better ideas about that than I do. Zach would certainly be one of them, and I'm sure that almost everybody on the panel would be a little more adept at that than I am. But I think the obvious thing is we have to do things, multiple things that will allow more water to get to the Great Salt Lake in particular, but to our lakes in general. And of course, that includes controlling suburban growth. That includes the idea that we can continue to build subdivisions where everybody has a Kentucky bluegrass lawn that they only walk on whenever they mow it. That kind of absurdity we can certainly end. It's not going to be an easy sell, but we've got to do it. I'll just say one thing that occurred to me while we were talking about alfalfa farming. When I was a young kid, active in the LDS Church, we had assignments to go out to quote the steak farm and help the steak farmer with their crop raising, in hoeing things, in harvesting things, and so forth. It's easy to harvest alfalfa. You can harvest a lot of alfalfa with one person, but if you want to turn that acreage over to, say, fresh vegetables, then that takes a whole different level of labor. And if we're going to do something more sensible than commit all these farms to things that make more sense in terms of a more reasonable diet, we're going to have to perhaps restore the culture of everybody along the Wasatch Front needs to help out.
Yeah.
So that's a societal and social change that I think is going to have to be part of the equation.
May I address the question of how we save the Great Salt Lake? Again,
Yes.
simplifying something. Two things. The first one is a dedicated or earmarked inflow where there's always enough water going in to maintain a certain elevation in the lake level. Dedicated, always. That the lake needs to have its own water right. And the second thing is deauthorize the Bear River project, which will simply make the whole problem that much worse. It's a terrible idea whose time was never really here, and now it's certainly not only obsolete, but actually quite damaging to society and against all kinds of social interests.
That's absolutely right. I just want to chime in and just follow up with just two other things that haven't already been said. So right now, if you own water rights, it is illegal, according to Utah law, for you to take your water and put it in the Great Salt Lake. If you try and do that legally, that water will not permanently be dedicated for the lake. There's been a lot of propaganda from the Utah State House that they made that legal. They did not for individuals, only for 4 agencies. So we need to open up water rights to allow individual water rights to take their property and put it in the lake, because we need vast quantities of water covering the lake bed to keep that dust underwater. The second thing we need to do is phase out the property tax for water. The municipal water use upstream would drop 20% if we did that. And we estimate that had we done that in 1998, when we first proposed the property tax phase out bill, Great Salt Lake would have 2 million acre feet more water in it today. That's 2 Bear River annual flows for Bear River flowing for 2 years. So the State House has a lot of the keys to these solutions, but we have to educate the State House. The permaculture question is a really good one. Why aren't we doing that? Utah legislators just don't honestly know that much about water. They're on a very steep learning curve. Water is very complicated. There's a long way to go. So I would encourage everybody to start a dialogue with your Utah legislator. Don't presume they know what you're talking about. I almost promise you they do not. If I were a betting man, I would wager they don't know anything about it. So those are the solutions. Start that dialogue, because the State House has all of our tax money, so much of our tax money, and they can invest in solutions. And with that, I'll shut up.
A lot of this comes down to good leadership. Now, Sarah Kenny has had her hand up for the longest time. Sarah, can you turn on your video so we can see who you are, too?
Oh, sure. Hold on one second.
Thank you.
Okay, can you see me?
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
I
Question.
put it in the chat, and my question was, is anyone working with farmers to see if there are alternative crops to alfalfa that they could grow that won't use as much water?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I can address that. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Great question. And the simple answer is yes. Lots is being done to look at alternative crops. And most farmers are interested in growing crops other than hay and alfalfa. The major challenge is just lack of market for other crops. And we have lots of examples of this happening, where an alternative crop pops up and people get excited and acres are grown, and then a market gets flooded. And all of a sudden farmers can't sell their crop. They lose a lot of money. Some go out of business. This happened with quinoa just 4 or 5 years ago. And it's happened with several other crops. And so that's the major challenge to alternatives, is just we don't have markets, close markets where farmers can sell these. And then it really depends on the type of crop, right? If you grow fresh fruit or produce, it can't travel very far. Or it takes special care to ship it because it's got a lot of water, it's heavy, it's expensive to move it. Dried crops that can be stored for years and then transported and moved inexpensively is what drives the markets. And so there's a lot of interest with farmers. There's a lot of activity at looking at other crops, and it's happening on small acres, small places. But to shift a major portion of our hay and alfalfa to a different crop means that we've got to have some new market that's going to support all that. Because farmers grow what they can sell, right? If they can't sell it, they're not in business.
Thank you. Thank
Hey,
you.
Matt, if I could chime in, I've just been biting at the bit here to share something.
Wait,
Gabe Brown
who is talking, please? Who is talking?
The one who has the next hand lifted up, and I've been chatting. You didn't
Can
look
you
at the
turn on
chat.
your can you turn your camera, please?
I can't. Unfortunately, I've tried on this Zoom call and I haven't been able to do it.
Okay, you have,
Okay.
is this Denise?
Yes, it is.
Okay,
So,
Denise, you have
Matt,
30
just
seconds
so
for
you
your
know, we have a 500-acre Delta, Utah farmer who does 15 cover crops, which we all and other farmers buy from him because they're untreated. He doesn't waste money, is not in debt. He uses 500 cattle to graze, manage grazing across there. There are solutions. The problem is the people who are deciding and the people at the universities, although I have Stephen Price from USU, we were at the SWAN meeting. I presented at the summit, the drought solutions. I showed all the examples around the world that I've put in the chat. This is what I teach. I've got 2 of my students on here. One has 7 acres in Linden. Another one has 38 acres down in Meadow, Utah by Fillmore.
And your question is,
My question is, why have all you professors and you experts not looked into the solutions of how to reverse the actual drought? You're dealing with symptoms of how to cover the lake. They want to spend $4 billion on the Great Salt Lake like California did, so the toxic fumes won't go anywhere, doctor. Well, that is not a solution to the actual core problem. The actual solutions to the problem have been done all over the world, and they need to be looked into here in Utah. It's not just permaculture, it's called ecosystem restoration.
I think you had a question for Matt. He talked that they are exploring permaculture. Matt, would you like to talk a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, so I'm not studying permaculture directly, but others at USU are. And it's a great option, great solution. Most often it works well in cities, right? Where we can convert other uses in other areas to a permaculture. In agriculture, I would say that most of alfalfa and hay crops in that sense could be considered permaculture. They're perennials, they're there, they stay there for a long time. And so it has a place. It definitely has a place. But when you look at large scale agriculture, it's going to take other solutions as well. And the caller mentioned some of those, and we're looking at those, and several are looking at different options, different cover crops, different practices that can help us save water.
Matt, may I interject?
So
if I may interject, Matt. Chance Lyman in Delta, Utah with the 500 acres has been working with the Farm Bureau, teaching regenerative agriculture. It uses much less water because you've got living soil organisms who turn it into a sponge that hold water, just like here at our school and on the vineyard farm that we did 2-year project. Cover cropping, no-till, they make more money, they use less water, and it is one of the biggest solutions, and they are teaching that here in Utah. And only Stephen Price and Dr. McCann down at the Moab USU Extension campuses seem to be aware of these things. We need to get all the universities on board with the best research and the best solutions and examples around the world that have worked. We don't have time to waste while nobody seems to be researching this. We have done all the research.
Jim, can I just jump in here, Jim? So can I just jump in here real quick, Jim? Because I don't think, I think we've got some really knowledgeable people on this panel, and I don't think anybody's pushing back on the value of permaculture at all. I haven't heard Matt push back on permaculture or anybody else, but we're all focusing on as much of the big picture as we can. I think it's easy when you're a hammer to view the world, all the world as a nail. There's one thing I want to be clear if we're going to talk about solutions. Climate change has shrunk the flows of the Colorado River by 20% in the last 22 years. And we're not at the bottom of that. That's because of increased carbon emissions from mankind. And what the scientists that are studying climate change are telling us is that we're probably halfway to the bottom, meaning sometime in the next few decades, perhaps earlier, Colorado River could bottom out at a 40% drop in flows. So if we're going to really address the problems that these shrinking snowpacks are having, we need to get on top of our carbon emission policy. And if we're not going to address that solution, we're going to have major problems dealing with these other things. So I just think, I know all but one of these panelists, I know how hard they work, how dedicated they are. And I just think we're all working as hard as we can for the solutions that we've studied. And I think all of us are eager, including Matt, of course, to find new solutions that we can implement that are achievable and that we have capital to do so with.
I think Norma Willis, you had your hand up a little while ago. Is there something that you would like to, a question you'd like to ask?
Yes, thank you. So I'm thinking down the road a little bit. So we talk about using or allowing farmers to sell their water rights to the growing urban areas, which, makes sense to me. But at some point, don't we run out of agricultural land? If these farms aren't producing, where are we going to get all this food for these growing urban areas? To me, that just seems like sort of catch-22. And I just wondered if anybody has any thoughts on that.
I have some thoughts on that. I bet Matt will too. Utah loses 30 acres of farmland each and every day to development, to black space, to urban development. And we are losing so much prime farmland. We are losing so much good farmland because our state house has not provided a way for us to really protect our farms. I'm really concerned about the loss of farms. And ironically, it's creating a water supply for the municipal core. I'm not particularly worried about water for our cities. I'm far more worried about what our future cities look like and whether there will be any agriculture. So I'm coming at it from a slightly different perspective. I like the idea of local agriculture, especially local food, and especially the high value crops are really under a lot of impact. That Utah County was, the king of a lot of the orchards in, north of Provo, and most of that stuff's gone now. So the most of the farmland we've got left is Cache and Box Elder County, and that's the breadbasket of Utah. And I personally am concerned about farmland losses.
If I might make a question here, it looks like so much of our water is used by agriculture, and so much of that water use goes to make crops that are designed for cattle feed, not for human consumption directly, but for cattle feed, and much of it is shipped abroad. Wouldn't it make better sense to devote more of that water to where it's more needed by more people? Brian, did you want to say something?
Yeah, one of the things that we specifically called for when we spoke to the LDS church leaders back in 2009 was, why not take all the lawns around all of your churches and turn them into community gardens? That would make good use of the water. It would provide a source of food for people who needed it. It would provide some buy-in on the part of the nearby community and neighborhoods. Obviously,
a good example.
We're disappointed that they didn't embrace that idea, but I think everybody on this panel can go push someone, whether it's your local church or the LDS Church headquarters or your local business or any other entity that has a lawn that nobody walks on except for when they mow it, and have them turn it into a community garden.
And what about city ordinances that don't permit that kind of thing? Don't you think that needs to be changed? So that
Exactly.
not only churches or schools or what have you, but homeowners could convert their lawns to gardens, be it permaculture or otherwise.
Sure.
Well, let me just chime in. The fact of the matter, though, is that crops like vegetables and fruit require huge amounts of labor in order to harvest. The scale of the agricultural workforce that Utah would require if it really shifted in that direction is something that is unprecedented. I don't think that, well, I mean, look at California. California has many, many millions of people, but requires a large immigrant workforce in order to harvest fruits and vegetables. So what Utah farmers are doing is economically rational, given that they have a zero price of water. If we put a rational price on water, then they'll change what they're doing. But that doesn't mean that the logical thing to do is to make Utah agriculture look like the California Central Valley. That may just not be feasible. I mean, it's nice to think about vegetable gardens, but I don't think that's practical when you consider all the inputs that are required in order to do that on a commercial basis.
Well, let me give you an example. If my local ward house changed their lawn into a community garden, instead of being asked by the local church to come over and contribute to vacuuming and cleaning up the chapel itself as they do right now, and snow blowing and blah, 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 that kind of maintenance. If you said, in addition to that, we're going to ask you to help with the community garden, the LDS Church, and I'm sure other churches too, have an infrastructure where they could actually get those kinds of volunteers to do that. That willing labor could be actually created just by asking for it, just by telling people, here's the problem and you can help. I don't think that's going to be the game changer, but I think it's part of the solution.
Right. Very good, Brian. Mike, you had your hand up for quite a while. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Jim. Thank you all panelists for a great discussion. I'm a former reclaimed water administrator for the state of Arizona. And I want to know, and I don't know who would know about this, but if I could ask one of the experts, why the Great Salt Lake can't be supplemented with reused or reclaimed water from all the municipalities on the Wasatch Front.
How would that work?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of water that comes from the municipalities, reused water and reclaimed water, and all it has to be is treated to the point where it can be diverted or delivered to the Great Salt Lake.
So the State House has been actually exploring this in committees. There was a committee this summer where they looked at it. There was a lot of opposition from the sewage treatment plants to it. So they're trying to look at this. The economics of the technology probably haven't arrived in the sweet spot in the price of water in Utah, meaning there are less expensive sources of water right now for the lake before the technology you're talking about gets to the sweet spot. So, I mean, clearly, you know, it's doable, it's technologically possible, but the price of water in Arizona obviously is so much higher, right? Phoenix's water is, if you look at their water rate structure, it's a skyrocket. It just shoots straight up like a rocket. And so that makes fertile ground for slightly more expensive technologies like the one you propose. So they could, but again, you know, there's easier phasing out the property tax, for example, and letting full users pay the full cost would greatly reduce water demand. Many of the cities of the Wasatch Front take water from before it flows into the Great Salt Lake and they pump it into the ground, keeping it from making it to the lake. They're doing that to fill their aquifers. So I think we tried to articulate this. Several of us have sort of said this. We're a long way from running out of water for our cities, especially on the Wasatch Front. So it's just like what you've seen in Arizona. As the price of water increases, then there's all this interest in these new kinds of technologies that have proven to work elsewhere.
And
So
Zach,
really
I
question.
think
Thanks,
you
Zach.
said in Arizona, where they've raised the price of water significantly, they've cut back on their water use significantly. So there's a very direct relationship between how we value water, how we price water, and how it's being used or conserved.
Yeah, I don't understand why we can't penalize water wasters and
Yeah.
incentivize people who conserve water. And the cities or the counties or the state should be paying people to replace their front yard grass with desert landscaping. It's insane.
Yeah, well,
May I tell you guys, if I may tell you guys my
There's an actual
experience.
example of that. They have turf buyback programs in Las Vegas and Los Angeles that have been wildly successful.
Right.
They just initiated the idea this year of doing turf buyback in Utah. Just 5 years ago, Water Conservancy district managers were saying, we'll never do that. That's a terrible idea. As one of them said, that just means skulls and rattlesnakes in your front yard. So we are learning that there are lots of solutions if we just have the political will to implement these kinds of solutions.
If I could add something here, a little bit of a plug for the Utah Valley Earth Forum. We have put together a website that's called xeriscape.uvef.org, where you could go and learn the many benefits of doing xeriscaping in your own yard, saving money, saving time, cutting down air pollution, all kinds of benefits, and some ideas for how to go about developing a xeriscape in your yard. And there are some communities, I understand, that have city ordinances that make it very difficult for a homeowner to replace, for example, their front yard or backyard, or especially their front yard, with a garden, a permaculture arrangement, or a xeriscape. If you go to that xeriscape.uvef.org, you'll see what a mature xeriscape looks like. It happens to be our yard. And we did this 16 years ago, and it's been a great savings. Other questions? Ernie, you have your hand up.
I do. I think it's been a super meeting, and I really like our panel. Maybe we need to schedule another one of these in the future. You've run your time out for tonight, as I understand it.
We could go as long as there are questions, Ernie. If you need to go to bed, you have my permission to leave and go to bed. I think Denise has another question. Denise?
So much, you guys. Thank you. I feel so frustrated, but at the same time, hope, because I do work with professors. Sean Miller at BYU, you provided that wonderful talk years ago. He and I went around to all the farmers to try to save open lands. We are working so hard with farmers. I just spoke to a 94 third generation farmer in Charleston up in Heber. And he said, before they put in that Deer Creek Reservoir and that Jordanelle and everything else that caused all the problems, okay, because that's holding water instead of letting the natural systems of the forest. He said there were forests up there. Now it's nothing but desert. As I drove home and looked at Timpanogos, all the hillsides are bare. That is the reason you are in a drought, Utah. That is a scientific biology 101 botany, I don't care what you want to call it, but the reason that you are in a drought and the West is in a drought and so many other countries found themselves in the same situation is because we deforested. Watch the Years of Living Dangerously when NASA tells Harrison Ford 40% of the problem on this earth and why we're heating up and we're going to be 140 degrees, including Nebraska and all these upper states, because we deforested. And if we put the vegetation back, which I shared with you on this chat, I hope you guys will look at it, but you will see all the examples around the world that's on our Utah Valley Permaculture Classroom Gardens and Greenhouse. Look at what they did. Proven drought solutions, brought back the rain with native vegetation within 5 years. We can do this in Utah.
Thank you.
It could have something to do with carbon and anthropogenic climate change.
Yeah, a
Yes,
lot.
it's-
It's carbon
It's
emissions.
much bigger than just deforestation.
It's carbon emissions. We cannot discount carbon emissions. We can't talk about solutions if we're not going to talk about carbon emissions. We can't deny
No.
the concentration of carbon dioxide. We can't turn a
Yes,
blind
but
eye.
Mr. Frankel,
But
guess what?
ma'am, we're not having a debate, and I think we've definitely heard your point. You made some great points, and we're not criticizing permaculture. We're just trying to acknowledge the science of climate change, because I have watched 40 years of climate change denial in our state policy, and I'm tired of it. So we have climate change. It is reality. It is science, and we're going to adopt it. Now, if we can implement permaculture, that's great. It doesn't have to be either or. But we are going to acknowledge that carbon emissions and mankind's carbon emissions are causing our snowpacks to shrink. It doesn't argue against what you said, but we can have both problems that are contributing to what we observe.
If we don't deal with the climate crisis and carbon emissions, we are going to be toast, and all of our comments will be to naught. So that is a first order priority. And how do we deal with that? How do we get to a situation where we really deal with that? We need good leadership. And if our leaders in Utah, our governmental leaders in Utah and nationally and worldwide don't get with it and do something very significant to help us move in that direction, we may be toast. So,
Jim, can I point out one of the interesting stories here is something about removing lawns. We talked about removing lawns, and I just wanted to mention that if you are willing to help change the policy level and the state level, the Utah State Legislature has considered several bills over the last 7 years to remove the requirement that cities have to require grass. Right now, many cities actually still require grass, and the State House has proposed getting rid of that requirement. So if you want to call your legislator and say, we need to get rid of this requirement, cities should not require grass, because there's so many wonderful, as we've all been saying, alternative landscapes that we can implement, which may or may not use water, but can certainly save a ton of water, even if they do use water. And we can have biodiversity in our local yards, and all kinds of ways to save water. So we still have top-down leadership that is defending our lawns, and we gotta be the second driest state in the country. That's just what we are. So let's just deal with it.
I love the suggestion that Brian made, that if we see the LDS Church and other churches replacing their lawns with xeriscaping or with water-wise landscaping, be it vegetable gardens or whatever, that would set a great example, and especially here in Utah. Sarah, you had a question? No, Brian. Well, Brian, a comment, and then Sarah, you're next.
Well, just to amplify that, Jim, we all recognize that we need much better and different public policy regarding all these issues. But in addition to that, we have got to change the culture. We have got to change the worship of Kentucky bluegrass. We have got to change the stigma of desert landscaping. I'll give you a specific example. 20 years ago, I xeriscaped my front yard. And I know behind my back, my neighbors referred to my yard as the ghetto of the neighborhood. I was in a very high-end suburban area, And even though I got away with xeriscaping, I didn't violate any city ordinances, or at least nobody turned me in. People in the neighborhood regarded my yard as, quote, the ghetto.
Mhm.
We have got to change people's appetites. We've got to change what they prioritize. We've got to change what is aesthetically pleasing. We've got to accept the reality of where we live. And that requires not only public policy change on the part of our leaders, but a wholesale change of our culture.
That Dan called that the new water ethic. That's part of the new water ethic. We have to think differently and elect leaders who also have the new water ethic and the new ethic of taking care of the planet. You know, stop this burning of fossil fuels and heating up the planet and what have you. Sarah, you had a question. You're muted.
Yes, one more question for me. I was just wondering from the panelists, what is the number one thing you think we as individuals can do to help the situation? Thank you.
I'd like to jump in first, and I know there'll be wonderful suggestions, and they'll be better than mine. For me personally, my biggest thing is to go educate your state legislators, because so much of our water policy is coming out of the state level. Our funding for programs, bad policies, the proposed Bear River development, proposed Lake Powell pipeline, those are all state projects, $6 billion in total spending. Denial of climate change, procrastinating leadership. So, you know, the questions that we're getting from the public here are so much more educated than the Utah legislators average. And so I'm always like that, you know, go educate your legislators, because almost all of the time they're friendly, they're polite, they're respectful, and they want to hear from you and they want to be educated about water. Sometimes you have to chase them down, but that conversation is so important. So that for me is the most important thing. If you have questions about how to do that, reach out to Utah Rivers Council. We'll help you. We'll even tell you who your legislators are and what their background is. Thank you.
I agree 100%.
But vote, get involved in politics. Vote, lobby, educate, get involved in politics. You get to choose in this country whether you're powerful or not. You get to choose the level of influence you have. Choose to be an influencer. Choose to be powerful.
Okay, Denise, one more quickie.
So I've been working for about 8 years since I started teaching here in Utah, and I have spoken to DNR directors, and they agree with me. The only way you're going to get people out of the drought and teach them not xeriscaping, because unfortunately rocks create heat, and you should see everybody's rocks, including Orem City, are covered in weeds, so they'll be chasing weeds all the time. The actual solution is drought resistant native plants. So I've been sharing this, and at the last Utah Lake Authority Symposium at UVU, they invited me to share the research. I hope that you guys will do the same thing.
Okay. Thank you.
Maybe I should just say, so xeriscaping doesn't mean in Salt Lake City what it does in Phoenix, Arizona. The word xeriscaping just means dry landscape, or a landscape that's appropriate to the nature. If you look at the hills around Salt Lake City, you don't see sand and rocks, you see grass. It's actually a native, Northern Utah is actually a native grassland. So xeriscaping in Northern Utah means actually grass, but not Kentucky bluegrass, different kinds of grass. And there are varieties of grass that don't require any supplemental irrigation once they get established. They're not going to be green in August, but they'll be green in lots of the other months of the year. And some of them grow fairly low and don't require mowing. So don't misunderstand xeriscaping to mean rocks. That's inappropriate for Northern Utah.
Okay, Annalise Harrison.
Yes, I'm with Saratoga Springs City, and one of the largest issues we have, and I think this goes back to what Brian was talking about in the change in culture, is our city has a lot of HOAs. And so the thing that we hear a lot from our residents is frustration, because the city, especially this year, you know, we reduced allotment sizes by 20%, which our residents reduced their usage in irrigation from irrigation sources. 17% after we did that. But their complaint was their HOAs were forcing them to water. They wanted that nice Kentucky bluegrass, you know? And so I think when you're talking with this legislation, it needs to go beyond the cities, because HOAs can have stricter code than city. And so cities can back off from what they're doing. But if the HOAs aren't allowing the residents in their neighborhoods to do that, it's pointless.
Yeah, I've heard this a lot. HOAs enacting stricter problems. You know, I think part of the challenge as well is aesthetics. You hit on it, Annalise. You know, I think these HOAs just want to maintain an aesthetic and a visual appeal. And it's interesting because the xeriscape word is a word that a lot of water-wise landscapers have gotten away from because it implies zero, and has become to be known as kind of what Gabriel mentioned a moment ago, just rocks. And it's become unpopular. So they've kind of come away from branding it. Jordan Valley Water has a program called Local Scapes, because they're trying to emphasize what you can see here that Jim is sharing, I presume, from his house, which of course this is a beautiful landscape. And they're trying to emphasize the diversity of plants, which actually fosters some local wildlife habitat, which is wonderful. This is kind of like my front yard, except not nearly as well maintained as Jim's. Jim, if you want to come over to my house and do some maintenance, I'd love that on my thing. But I think you're right. I think it's going to take some time to kind of educate HOAs that we can have landscapes that look nice, but don't need to use giant quantities of water. So it's not just grass or nothing, it's grass or a whole range of options that are wonderful.
Yes, well, this is our front lawn. I tell you, the birds and the bees love it. They're all over the place. And some of the advantages are it saves water, saves time and labor, saves energy, saves money, cuts air pollution, cuts noise pollution, cuts water and land pollution, looks attractive, that's very important, and reduces waste and xeriscaping. It sets a good example.
And Jim, you don't have to plaster it with chemicals either.
Right. We don't spray it, we don't cut it, we don't no bug problems or no gophers. It's a very, very low maintenance. The only thing, I go out and every now and then I trim it, and in the spring I zap a few of the little weeds that come up hither and yon. They're not many, because we don't have an environment that loves bugs and rodents and fungus and what have you. We don't have any of those problems. It's great. And this is xeriscape.uvef.org. It'll beautify, save you money, water, time, and effort. It's not the only solution, but it's a good one.
I'm sorry, Jim. I've got to go eat dinner. It's getting late.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for being here. Panelists, you did a great job. Thank you very, very much. And the Utah Valley Earth Forum is thankful to all of us, and I think we've presented some good solutions here. I'm reminded of the old saying that about the environment, don't just change your light bulbs, change your leaders. We need really good leadership here. And churches can set a good example too. Great.
Thanks, guys.
It's been great. We've recorded this all, or
Thank
most
you.
all of it. And if you want to see it again, you can go to our website, uvef.org. And there'll be a link there where you can watch it again on Facebook, or you can watch it on YouTube. Thank you all. Goodbye, good luck, and may the good Lord take a liking to you, as Roy Rogers used to say.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.